My name is Sergio, and I want to share a story that happened a few years ago when my husband and I took our young daughter on a trip and stayed in a 3-star hotel. Our daughter, Estefania, was 5 years old at the time. We traveled from Mexico to the United States to take her sightseeing during the summer vacation. My spouse had reserved a room in that hotel weeks in advance, so we checked in immediately upon arrival. The place wasn't the nicest, but it was very affordable. We knew it was a 3-star hotel and weren't expecting anything spectacular, which didn't bother us. We've never been ones to stay in 5-star hotels since we only use hotels for sleeping. Something I noticed as soon as we entered the reception was a lady and her husband complaining to an employee about something. I didn't understand much since she spoke very fast in English, but she was visibly upset, and from what I could gather, they wanted a refund for the upcoming nights they had booked because they wanted to leave. We were then given our key and took the elevator up to our room on the 3rd floor, which was also quite modest. Again, it didn't bother us. What did concern my spouse and me was when, upon entering, my daughter asked me to carry her, looking scared and on the verge of tears, telling us that she didn't want to stay there because she was very frightened. This was strange, as she had never acted like this anywhere else. We asked her what she was afraid of, and she just hugged me tightly and kept begging us to leave. We tried to calm her, assuring her that everything would be fine and that we were going to have a lot of fun in the city and the parks. Although we didn't completely convince her, she did calm down a bit. They say children are more sensitive. They perceive things that we adults may not. And that was something my spouse and I learned that time, because my daughter was right to be afraid, and we were about to find out why. That first night I went to take a shower while my daughter and my spouse stayed in bed watching cartoons to help her fall asleep. Suddenly I heard my daughter crying outside. I thought it was because she was still scared, but I felt reassured knowing my spouse was with her, so I continued showering. However, the crying suddenly intensified. It was a child's sob at first, but then transformed into the cry of an adult man. It's hard to describe, but that was my impression. I grabbed my towel and ran out of the bathroom. I went towards where my spouse and daughter were, but she was sound asleep. My spouse looked puzzled, wondering why I had rushed out dripping wet. I quickly asked why Estefania was crying. She looked confused and asked what I was talking about, saying Estefania had been asleep since I started showering and that no one had been crying. I told her what I had heard, and she suggested it might have been from a neighboring room, though she hadn't heard anything. But I was sure it had come from our room, where my family was. I had to let it go. We turned everything off and went to sleep. But in the middle of the night, my daughter woke us up with a scream. We got up and held her, thinking she had a nightmare. Through tears, she asked, "Mommy, who was that man standing by the bed looking at us? Tell him to go away." We were frightened and turned, but saw nothing. I turned on the lights to show her that no one was there, that it had been just a nightmare, but she insisted it was real, that the man had a very ugly face and dirty teeth. My spouse was scared by the description our daughter gave of the figure she saw, and it took us a long time to convince her it was just a nightmare and to go back to sleep. Eventually, we all managed to sleep, but the following morning, while our daughter was in the bathroom, my spouse told me something chilling. She had been trying to fall asleep but was very frightened by what Estefania had told us. Then she suddenly saw a shadow like a person crawling on the ceiling. She was so terrified she covered herself from head to toe and didn't want to uncover herself, not wanting to wake up and scare our daughter further. But it was very real, something very evil. By this point, both of us knew something bad was happening there. We had never experienced anything like this in any other hotel. There was something sinister in that room, but we decided not to say anything since our daughter had just come out of the bathroom, and we didn't want her to hear anything about what had happened. That morning, we went down to the lobby because we were heading out to take public transportation to explore the city. But before leaving, we saw that the woman who had been upset the day we arrived was now speaking with the manager. Perhaps they were arranging for her refund, and my spouse told me to take the child outside and wait for a moment. Later, I saw from outside that she was speaking with the lady after she had spoken with the manager. When she came out, she told me, "We're not the only ones who experienced things here. The lady and her husband left because of the same reason." It turns out the lady told my spouse that she and her husband had heard horrible noises in their bathroom at night and didn't know what they were. But when he checked, there was nothing. The lady also felt something touching her hair in the middle of the night when she opened her eyes. She couldn't see anything, and her husband was asleep facing the other way, among other spooky things that happened, which is why they were asking for a refund. So she advised my spouse to do the same. We no longer knew what to do. I didn't even enjoy the movies that day because I was worried we would have to return to sleep in that hotel where very strange things were happening. That night, my spouse had to wrap up my daughter to get her to sleep because she was very afraid and couldn't fall asleep again. At exactly 4 in the morning, we felt something hit the underside of the bed so hard that we woke up. I ran to turn on the light and looked under the bed with my cell phone, but no one was there. Yet there was something sinister. I asked my spouse and daughter to get off the bed, and I moved it completely, exposing the floor underneath, where there was a pentagram carved into the floor. That was the last straw. I immediately called the front desk, and soon a hotel employee came up. We showed him what was there on the floor. I was very upset, but the young man was as astonished as we were. It was obvious he had no idea that was there. He was very nervous because he didn't know what we were talking about. My spouse told him we knew it wasn't his fault, but please, for that night, could he change our room? And so he did. The next day, we met with the manager to see if we could also get a refund since we still had 4 nights left there, but we wanted to leave. He said we would be refunded part of the money in a month, which was the most he could do for us. Although we never got any money back, it doesn't compare to the great relief we felt after leaving that hotel and renting another far away. I don't know what kind of things they did in that place, though it's more than obvious that they practiced Satanism and performed rituals, given what was engraved there. Not to mention all the paranormal events that occurred in that place, which is charged with such bad energy that even my own daughter felt it from the moment we arrived. And unfortunately, my spouse and I didn't pay enough attention. My name is Emilio, and a few years ago in my youth I went on a summer vacation with my best friend at the time. I'm talking about the early 2000s. He and I were on the brink of starting college, and we decided to take a trip to Costa Rica. We are Mexican and had limited money since we were still dependent on our parents, and what we could save was modest. Our plan was essentially backpacker style, economize as much as possible, especially on accommodations. We looked at many hostels and we already had one in mind, but then my friend found a 2-star hotel that had the same rates as the hostel, and staying at the hotel would mean a room and bathroom to ourselves. In the hostel, there could be up to 6 people per room, so for obvious reasons we preferred to rent a room at this hotel, which I must clarify no longer exists, so it's pointless to mention the name. Upon arrival, the hotel, an obviously very old building, was lacking in cleanliness. It was a very modest place that needed many repairs and even looked a bit dirty, but what could we expect for the price we paid? After all, for 2 boys of our age, these were the least of our concerns. Nothing could take away the excitement of being alone in another country and having the chance to explore it. We would use the hotel merely as a place to sleep and shower. I remember the place being somewhat eerie at night because it had very dim lights. The receptionist was only there during the day. At night, there was no one at the reception, and they would lock the hotel. Only guests who had the key could enter. There was one man in particular, an important character in this story, Don Joel, the hotel's janitor. We saw him that afternoon when we first arrived at the hotel. We went up to shower and then left for the whole day. Later we went for a drink and returned to the hotel around 11 at night. When we entered the hotel with our key, Mr. Joel gave us a good scare because he suddenly came out from a dark hallway, which he was finishing mopping before going home. He approached us and said the following. For no reason should you leave your room after midnight no matter what you hear. Do not come out until it is daylight. It is obvious that you are not from here. That is why I want to warn you. My friend looked at me and just thanked him for the tip. After that, we both went up to our room. Since we were both somewhat tipsy, we took his warning as a joke, and yes, we laughed about what he had told us. Those were the words of a kindly man, but we were young and incredulous. We just got into bed and fell deeply asleep. Past 2 in the morning, I suddenly woke up after hearing loud noises outside our room, as if something were dragging something like heavy metal across the floor, which I found extremely strange. I woke up my friend so that he could listen, and we remembered what that man had told us. My friend, in search of adventure, told me we should go check it out. To do so, we would have to open the door. So, I told him no, that I was young, but not stupid. I don't know how long those noises lasted, but when they finally stopped, we both went back to sleep. But not a minute passed when we heard something much worse. Something I still cannot forget. Those were like animal moans coming from the hotel lobby. It made our skin crawl. We both blurted out a curse into the air and then laughed nervously. We were very disconcerted. The next day in the morning, we got ready to go out again, and it was almost noon when we left the room. Just when we were going down to the lobby, there was Don Joel cleaning the floor. We did not hesitate to tell him what we had heard the night before and asked him what was happening in that place. But then we saw that the man turned to look at the receptionist, and the receptionist looked at him very threateningly, as if telling him with his eyes not to talk to us and not to tell us anything. So the man just replied, "I don't know anything. I just got here." At that moment, we understood that he could not talk right then, but we knew that something very bad was happening there, and the employees knew it, but were forbidden to talk. We realized why the room rates were ridiculously cheap, and we also understood why we had not seen any other guests there since we arrived. We never knew if we were the only ones staying there those days, or if there were more people, but we never saw anyone else other than the few employees. In the end, we spent the whole afternoon outside, having fun, and we forgot about that event until night fell, and it was time to return to the hotel. This time we arrived a little earlier. The receptionist was still there, by the way. He had a very unfriendly face. We went up directly to the room to shower and rest, but around 11 there was a knock on the door. It was Don Joel, the janitor, who had taken advantage of the fact that the receptionist was no longer there to come and talk to us. This time he told us, "Boys, leave here tomorrow if it is possible for you. Very bad things happen here at night. You have already been able to verify that. Those noises are not from humans. There is a lot of evil activity here, I know what I am telling you." My friend wanted to interrogate him more, but the man was in a hurry. He had to leave because it was going to be midnight. So he told us that he could no longer tell us more, but that if it were possible, we should heed his advice and leave. He left and we locked ourselves in the room, both completely scared. We were just kids playing at being adults and experiencing freedom for the first time, and we did not know what to do. But for that night we had to stay because it was already 12 and we had nowhere to go. We both stayed awake as neither of us could sleep. We were chatting in a low voice with the light off. Everything was completely dark when suddenly I felt that my friend raised the zipper of my pants. Jokingly, I said a curse and told him to move over there, but he asked me what I was talking about, that he was on the edge. I immediately jumped out of the bed and turned on the light, and indeed he was at the other end of the bed and covered with another blanket. I was very scared. I told him that I had felt something that had touched my foot and felt very heavy. He replied, "Don't start with absurd jokes right now, please." I repeated many times that it was no joke, that I really felt it, and I thought it had been him. Seeing me like that, he believed me, and immediately also got up from the bed. We were both completely disconcerted. He began to pack and told me, "Let's get out of here." But just then, as if what inhabited that place knew we wanted to leave, Things began to be heard outside again, things being dragged, and as if heavy things were being thrown from the upstairs floor, something completely incredible and sinister. I told my friend that I would not leave the room crazy. We spent the whole night locked up with the light on, sitting on the bed listening to all kinds of noises from outside, very scared and fed up. It barely dawned, and we both left there. We did not even cancel the room. We just left with our suitcases and looked for a hostel. Once we were in another place, we met other backpackers and talked with them. We told them what had happened to us in that hotel, and they told us that they had heard that things happened there because the place was very old, and many years ago it had been a prison that later was abandoned, and that all kinds of people went there to do satanic rituals and all that sort of thing. Even when that place was abandoned, several lifeless bodies had been found there until they made it into a hotel. But they did not invest much in the remodeling, because the place honestly looked like it was going to fall apart from how old it was. Today, we are only left with that terrifying anecdote for life. And I still remember with affection that kind man, Don Joel, who advised and warned us from the first day we arrived there that something sinister was happening in that place. I hope you like the story I'm about to tell you. It happened to me during a business trip when I stayed in a hotel for one night, even though it was supposed to be 2. The company I work for sent me to a hotel that is supposedly 5-star, and I say supposedly because the experience I had does not really align with that. I arrived at the hotel utterly exhausted after driving for 8 hours. It was a very large and elegant hotel. I was attended to in the lobby and given the key to my room, which was on the 7th floor. All seemed well up to that point. It was around 10 at night, and I just wanted to sleep and rest as much as possible since I had a business meeting at 8 the next morning. I took a quick shower, put on my pajamas, and went to bed. But as if on cue, at that very moment, I began to hear the loud crying of a baby in the room next door. The crying was incredibly loud, and the closer I got to the wall adjoining that room, the louder it became. I couldn't believe what was happening. I thought it would stop soon because logically, I assumed the mother would calm the baby down as quickly as possible by rocking it or in some other way. I don't have children myself, so I'm not very knowledgeable about these things, but I'm not lying when I say that a whole hour passed and the baby was still crying incessantly at a very loud volume, so much so that it was starting to give me a headache. I hesitated to call the front desk to complain because I didn't want to seem like a bad person for complaining about a crying baby. But it was just too much. I couldn't sleep and I had to get up early. So I decided I should call and ask for another room on a different floor or far away from there. A young woman, one of the receptionists, came up to my room along with a bellboy to both give me the news that none of the rooms next to mine were occupied. I told them to come in and listen for themselves, and they too heard the uncontrollable baby cries. Both were astonished, and the woman told the bellboy to open the room to check it. They both went in while I stood outside watching everything. The room lights were off, and when the bellboy turned on the light, the bed was made and everything was impeccable. There was truly no one there. He checked everywhere, including the bathroom and the closet, and it was all completely empty. As soon as the man opened the door, the crying stopped, which honestly made me very nervous. The woman looked at me with a face of astonishment and a nervous laugh, as if to say, "What the hell is going on?" The man came out of the room and locked it again, and the second he did, the crying started again at full volume. I simply told them I couldn't stay there, so I began packing up the few things I had taken out of my suitcase and brought my belongings downstairs. Meanwhile, I called my company to book another hotel because after that, it was impossible for me to stay there. It was clear that it wasn't a baby. I don't know if it was a demon, a ghost. I don't know, but I didn't want to stay to find out. The hotel apologized but never mentioned a refund, which honestly didn't affect me since my company was paying for everything. However, I felt they were rather indifferent to the attention they gave me after what happened, which even they couldn't explain. I have always said that hotels are loaded with energies. We never know who has passed through them or died there. That hotel is very old, so it doesn't surprise me that such activity could be haunting the place. We never found out whether it was a tormented soul or a demon. This event took place in 2019 when I traveled with my parents to a magical town in Mexico. We are from Argentina and decided to explore some of the most beautiful and touristy spots in that lovely country. The entire trip was marvelous, except for one terrifying incident that occurred at one of those hotels. My name is Rodolfo, and here is my story. As I mentioned, we stayed at this very beautiful 4-star hotel which had 5 floors, and we requested a room on the top floor to enjoy the balcony view. We spent all day on the streets and finally returned to the hotel at night to rest. We took turns showering, and afterwards my parents lay down in their bed, and I lay in mine, right beside them. We turned off the light, and my parents were just falling asleep while I was still on my cell phone. It's important to mention the time because it is quite relevant. It was exactly midnight. Suddenly I heard a knock at the door. My mother sat up in bed and looked at me. We both stayed silent, and then there was another knock, very subtle this time. My mother asked who could be knocking at such an hour. I responded that I had no idea. It was rather strange, honestly. My father didn't even wake up since he sleeps very heavily. I got up from bed, but my mother immediately told me not to open it, just to look through the peephole and ask who it was. That's exactly what I did. I stood behind the door and asked what the person wanted while peeking through the small peephole. I could only see someone dressed in what seemed to be the hotel maid's uniform, but no one responded until I asked a third time. A woman's voice then said, "Good evening, I've come to clean," which was utterly nonsensical at that hour. Hotel cleaning doesn't usually happen at night because obviously, people are sleeping. I looked at my mother, who had an expression of bewilderment and was whispering to me not to open the door, to tell the woman that we were sleeping and she should come back in the morning. That's precisely what I told the woman, and she took several seconds to reply. I continued standing behind the door, waiting for her to respond because I could see that she was still there. It was a bizarre situation. I was about to tell her to come back the next day, but before I could finish my sentence, she interrupted by saying, "I need to clean. Let me in." This was exceedingly strange. My mother got up from bed and said in a loud voice, "Miss, these are not appropriate hours for cleaning. Please leave because we want to rest." There was a complete and very uncomfortable silence, and the woman at the door never showed her face as she was bent over, but she remained there, standing motionless, which honestly made me somewhat scared. This felt incredibly disturbing, to be honest. My mother went back to bed and whispered to me to come to bed and leave it be, to let her leave whenever she wanted. We don't know how she heard, but the woman responded, "I am not leaving until you let me in." That was a breaking point for both of us. My mother immediately called the front desk to file a complaint while I went to wake up my father, who had been asleep throughout the whole episode. We were explaining to him what had happened when someone knocked on the door again. We assumed it was the same woman, persisting, but then we heard a man's voice saying he was a hotel employee, so I opened the door. The woman was no longer there. We didn't know when she had left, but we relayed the entire incident to the gentleman, who said he would check the surveillance footage and report the employee, as he didn't recognize her description, and at that hour, there were supposed to be no maids at the hotel. They usually arrived in the morning and left by afternoon. He apologized and reassured us that they would address the issue so it wouldn't happen again. He then left, and we returned to bed, and the rest of the night passed peacefully. The following morning, when we went down to the lobby, the same gentleman informed us that they had reviewed the surveillance tapes, but the security cameras had not recorded anyone until he arrived. No one else had even passed through that hallway, as it was just us and another family staying at that end of the floor. My mother was quite upset, thinking they were trying to deceive us, but the gentleman was very assertive, and he seemed as surprised as we were. My mother requested to see the camera footage herself, but was told that was not allowed. The gentleman then spoke to one of the maids who happened to pass by and asked her in front of us what time she had left the previous night. She answered that she had left at her usual time, 8 p.m. He further inquired if she knew when her colleagues had left, to which she replied that she and another maid had been the last to leave, after all their colleagues had already gone. He thanked her and she left, looking very nervous. There was not much more to be done. My father and I convinced my mother to go out and enjoy the town, as that was why we were there, to put the incident behind us. That afternoon we returned to the hotel around 6 to shower and change, because we had a dinner reservation at a restaurant. When we got into the elevator, the girl whom the hotel employee had questioned that morning also got in with us. With considerable embarrassment, she apologized for bothering us but said she wanted to share something in confidence, so we could understand what had happened the night before without being scared. My mother encouraged her to speak, promising we would keep it confidential. She then explained that the maid who had disturbed us the night before was no longer alive. She had worked there for many years, had health issues, and one afternoon while cleaning on that floor, she had a heart attack and died right there in one of the rooms. No one discovered her in time, and she had died there. She also mentioned that she and her colleagues sometimes saw her around the hotel, and that we were not the only guests who had seen her. The hotel had received several complaints of this kind, which they had never mentioned to us when we filed our complaint. While we listened, my mother nervously smiled, unsure whether to believe the girl's story. I believed her, thinking that we often linger for a long time in the places where we lose our lives. But my parents are too skeptical. That last night we stayed there, we never saw her again, but we were left with that lifelong mystery because we never truly know what happened or who was knocking at our door asking to be let in. Although they believe it was that unfortunate maid who lost her life in that place. Thank you for listening to these stories. I hope you enjoyed them. Much more content is on the way. Subscribe and activate the little bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. Have a great evening, everyone. See you next time.